Good evening. It is Thursday, August the 31st, about 10:15 p.m. This is Shay Gibson with WeatherFlow bringing you a tropics update as we continue to watch some activity in the Atlantic Basin. This is not uncommon for this time of the year to see an increase in activity and stronger storms. In fact, I put this out today where we have a graph that shows the peak of the hurricane season being September the 10th. So I put "we are here," which basically says August the 31st. This is the last day of meteorological summer, and we are heading into the peak of the hurricane season. So not to be alarmed, but this is the time of the year that we start to see an increase in activity. We saw it recently with Major Hurricane Harvey. That did some extensive damage to the Texas coast, and it continues to do more damage as it heads up into the Tennessee area. In fact, right now it's still a tropical depression. Even after all this time, still heading to the northeast at 20 miles per hour. We do expect that this forward speed will increase a little bit as it heads up across the southeast region and eventually out over the mid-Atlantic over the next several days. But for right now, it's still causing problems. In fact, if we look at the GRE radar and let this load just a little bit, it's a little bit choppy right now. But you can see the tropical characteristics still holding with it. Some of these storm bands and tropical bands still pulling up from the Gulf of Mexico, creating some storm lines and tornado warnings. There's a lot of tornadic activity associated with this. In fact, this may be the profile for tomorrow for a lot of the southeast, as well as the moisture profile builds to the east of the system as it heads off to the northeast. So Harvey not over yet. We may lose the depression status and may go down to post-tropical overnight tonight, if not tomorrow, but just know that it's still there, still being a problem. The next area of disturbance is down the Bay of Campeche from the NHC. It was a little bit higher earlier at 20%, and it's down to 10%. A lot of this has to do with this being an area of convergent moisture. So we have easterly trades coming across the Caribbean, across the Yucatan Peninsula. We have a little bit of moisture training in from the subtropical jet over in across from the Pacific. And so what we end up with is a little bit of a convergent area of low pressure that tries to develop in this area. And if it's successful, sometimes they can develop into a storm very quickly. But in this area, I think the pattern is a little bit too volatile for it. In fact, if we look at the water vapor imagery, we can see a pretty extensive ridge building in across New Mexico and Texas with very dry air moving down into this area over to the north. There's some upper shear as well. You can see this moisture pulling down to here. You can see some of the moisture coming across the Caribbean. The area that they're discussing is down here at the very, very bottom of the map. But I do think that this dry air is going to stay on it to the north, and it's going to basically shear off any activity that tries to develop. And even if it does, it may lift to the north and get pulled off to the northeast by the next trough coming down. So I don't think it's going to be too much of a threat. I wouldn't be surprised if the NHC drops this 10% to 0 by tomorrow. But we'll continue to watch it because you never know if any of these patterns change over the next few days. The system may be back on the table. So going back to the 5-day graphic, another little area just moved off of Africa, and that is given a 40% chance of development next 5 days. This one is favored to develop, so we'll continue to watch. It's just a large tropical wave moving off of Africa now. But the big one right now, the big talk is Hurricane Irma became major hurricane at 115 miles per hour, Category 3. So this morning it's at 5 a.m. update, the winds were 70 miles per hour, and by the time the 11 a.m. update rolled around, it had gone to a Category 2 hurricane. So there was some rapid intensification occurring with this system. If we look at the system now, this is via SIMS tropical cyclones. We see that there's an eye to it. Now the eye was a little bit more impressive earlier. It had a little bit more symmetry to it. The entire system had a little bit more symmetry to it. But it looks like the eye wall might be in process of restructuring. There's a little bit of collapse on it. I think that there's some dry air being entrained into the system. In fact, if we look to the northwest, we see these oranges peel up. That is the Saharan air layer, which is dust suspended at about 500 millibars or 18,000 feet or so. And these systems tend to ingest this dry air. This is normal for that side of the Atlantic where we have that African dust that comes off the coast. But you can see how there's sort of these little dry, like the wet bands are sort of getting that dry look to it, especially around the backside. You get some of these little dry pockets that get wrapped up around the system. So the precipitable water looks very tight around the core. So I think this system may remain a little bit more on the compact side, maybe a little bit of a wider girth as far as the profile looks, but the actual core of the system will be staying more compact over time. We can see that a little bit better right here, and this is the dust where you can see it training off of the African coast, and this is through Weatherbell. down into the core all the way. So you can see that spiral of that dry, dusty air being pulled right into the system. But if we look in time, if we go out to 6 hours and we go out to 12, and then 18, 24 hours, we go out to 48 hours, we see that that moisture really saturates the air around it, and it dissipates that dust. It basically precipitates that dust down to the surface and gets rid of it. So that's the process for how these systems maintain their strength, is how well the moisture core can handle that dry air. In fact, if we look at the water vapor imagery for the Atlantic, we can see all that dry air right here to its northwest. So it's got a little bit of this to kind of contend with over the next couple of days. It is also moving over cooler water, which is a big factor. So 27, 28 degree water is where it's heading. That's about 80 to 82 degrees. Ideally, you would want it about 84.2 degrees or higher. And as the system moves more to the west and drops to the southwest, we can see those water temperatures really warming up again to 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 86 degrees. In fact, if we look at the wind alert, this is the wind alert storm track that we send out. You can find that windalert.com/storm/Irma. It's a free tool, and it shows all of our weather stations and all the weather stations everywhere around with the averages and gusts. Lots of other information there. It's a really good tool. But you can see the sea surface temperatures where it's going to be heading to the west-northwest and then dropping down to these warmer waters. And this is where this system is really going to have a little bit more of a chance to blow up into a stronger storm. So some models think it could blow up into Category 5. Some think it's going to stay. It'll get to Category 4 and stay. But the Category 3 is even questionable in my mind at this point when it gets over these cooler waters. I think it may drop to Category 2. And then as it drops back to the south, that's where it could re-enhance again over those warmer waters. So we'll see. I mean, with dry air and cooler water, it's usually not a good combination for a major hurricane to maintain that strength. It may go through eye wall restructuring and then re-strengthening again. And that's certainly possible, especially this far out in the game. The big question is going to be where it goes. So we also, when we're talking about intensity, I do want to back up just a second. We look at the THCP, which is the tropical cyclone heat potential, and the system is right about here. So it's going to be moving into cooler waters, but as it moves down here, this is where you have the pelagic zone of the ocean, where the warm waters are and how deep those warm waters are. If you have a system like this that moves over a very shallow warm layer, it stirs up the surface and you have cool water upwelling. The system tends to sort of fizzle itself out over these cooler waters once it does that. But if you have deeper, warmer waters, this heat potential increases. So it's going to be moving into this area of favorable heat potential for a system, and that goes all the way up to this area. So getting back to the track of this thing, the GFS ensembles keep the system. There's sort of a split in the model thinking on this. The GFS wants to bring it up to the northwest and maybe hook it or send it to the north, and then you also have the European. This is the European ensembles, 51 members. And this one, statistically, the European model is more exact. It tends to be, especially when it's consistent on a system doing certain things, it tends to be a little bit more, it definitely is more successful in the statistical sense. So, but you can see the myriad of possibilities even from the Euro. There's just too much uncertainty to know whether or not it's going to impact the U.S. mainland. What we do know is that its forward motion to the west and to the west-southwest may put the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and those areas in the path of the system. Even the GFS ensemble gets it very close out at 144 hours or 6 days, but it's not exact at this point. 6 days is, I mean, think about Tuesday, Wednesday next week is when that 6-day period of 144 hours is. So this track could change quite a bit. Both of these models have plenty of time to sort of readjust every day, every run. The Euro comes out at 12 midnight and also 12 p.m. in the afternoon. The GFS runs every 6 hours, but the Euro is the one that really, you know, when it comes to these kind of major systems, the Euro really does a pretty good job. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the GFS. Here's the system right here. And as we move into time, we'll go ahead and run this one forward. And you can see how the system moves to the west-southwest, just like what the Euro shows, or just what the National Hurricane Center. Then once it gets here, it starts to head off to the northwest. And beyond this, we really can't go too much further. I mean, we're talking 156 hours, 144. It's really kind of, I mean, I'll run the model, but it's not going to be very, I mean, it's kind of pointless to do it, but just to show you what the GFS is carrying it off to the northwest and hooking it up the coastline. But this is far from what may happen. And then you can even see a trough up here in the United States. There's always these systems that are coming across the United States from west to east that could pull this system away. If the GFS is correct and it brings it up to the northwest, it's a timing factor a lot of times as to whether or not we get a trough. This looks like it's pinching it off into an upper low, but that could guide the system out to the sea. The other thing we look at is high pressure that builds across the Atlantic. We have a Bermuda Azores ridge that builds down. If this ridge builds further down to the southwest, it tends to suppress these systems down and keeps them more on a westerly track. And that's what the Euro is doing, because the Euro is building that ridge down. In fact, if we take a look at the Euro at that time, we can see just how strong that ridge is right here. And so this is clockwise flow coming down, and it's going to basically push this system further west. And this is what the Euro is saying at this point. But we are talking 168 hours according to this particular time slot. But that will keep the system going across maybe even Cuba and even into the Gulf, being a Gulf threat. We definitely do not need that. But that's sort of a possibility very, very far out. I mean, we're talking, I would say right about here is about as far as we really want to go. Between 120 and 144 hours out is where we really need to focus. In fact, these folks along the Lesser Antilles, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, even if the GFS is correct, it's still a very close call. You could still get tropical storm to hurricane force storm winds out beyond the center of the system. So even a close call for these islands means you really need to be on guard for what's going on. This is the immediate threat right now, not the United States. We are not looking that far forward yet. So I know that there's a couple of videos out there floating around that are showing potential landfall on the southeast, and then the potential landfall on the northeast. And the models are showing, sort of a biased model trait for that kind of a forecast. But for right now, for all intents and purposes, we're safe in the United States. These islands right here need to be on the lookout. That is the first immediate threat that I see in the next 5 to 6 days. Outside of that, Irma is expected, like I said, to remain at a major hurricane status, maybe reach a 4, and then by Tuesday, September the 5th, be just on the doorstep of the Lesser Antilles. So that's sort of the thinking right now with Irma. Sort of recap that. We're not really in any threat on the United States at this point. The southeast, even southern Florida, we have to continue to watch the system. If the GFS is correct, it may hook away from the coast. If the Euro is correct, they may sort of come into an agreement with each other. If they do, that will be even more data to really pay attention to. Once you start to get model agreement, where they sort of align with each other's tracks, then there may be some concern at that point. But for right now, we're okay. That's going to do it for this update at the time. And I'll try to get back on tomorrow night to do another update. We'll wait and see what the Euro does for the 12 o'clock midnight run tonight and see if there's any agreement with the GFS. And we'll see what the NHC says tomorrow. So that'll do it for this tropical forecast. Thanks for watching and stay safe.